Thanks. It's fun to be here with folks who I hadn't met, whose work I loved, and folks who I met before, whose work I loved. It's already been fun to talk about ideas and stuff. And so the talk today is going to be kind of a bit of a broad sweep. I'm going to talk about some of the earlier work we were up to looking at irrationality in the economic domain, and then some newer work that we're up to looking at potentially irrationality in the social domain. But just so you get a sense of where the talk's going to go, I'll start with why I think it makes sense from a kind of psychology perspective to study the origins of irrationality in monkeys. Then we'll introduce some of the older work that we've been up to, trying to see whether we can see things like framing effects in non-human primates. And the punchline there, which I'll kind of give away at the start in case you fall asleep, is that we're going to see cases where non-human primates seem to be being as biased as monkeys. Then we're going to be talking about some of the newer work that we've been up to, trying to look at other kinds of economic biases, but particularly biases within the social domain. And here, just to kind of give away the punchline again, is the spot where we're going to be seeing some human-unique kinds of biases. And then at the end, hopefully, we'll have a big productive discussion about what all this means and so on. But just to start on the origins of irrationality, this is an audience where I don't have to necessarily justify studying non-human primates or studying the evolutionary origins of things. But here's the kind of intro I give for my psychologists about why this is relevant. And it starts with a bit of a situation that some of you may find yourself in. This is a situation I'm in right now where I'm giving a talk to some folks, some of whom I've never met before. And we have these meetings ahead of time where we try to get to know each other and make this sort of idle chit chat. And luckily for me, I'm a human with verbal language, so I can do this pretty easily. But the goal in those situations is you're trying to get to know somebody and you ask some of these questions. And so the kind of audience participation part is, what are the kinds of questions you ask in a situation like this? Your kind of private meetings, getting to know people. So audience, you guys have to participate and make sure you're awake. So what questions do you ask? What do you do? Where are you from? Yeah, that was what I was going with this one, right? Where are you from? So I give this talk to lots of different audiences. Usually people come up with the answer more quickly. I think you guys thought I was going somewhere else with this. But this is a question we ask, right? Like, why do we ask it? Well, it matters where you're from, right? If you're from LA or you're from New York or you're from the very same street that I grew up on, it tells me something really important about who you are right now, even if you haven't been there for a really long time. And this is the way I like to introduce why it's important to study the evolutionary origins of cognition, because if we're ever going to get at the roots in psychology of all this crazy stuff we do, we're going to be at a loss to do this if we just study adult humans. We need to know where this stuff comes from in the first place. And I think you've seen colleagues this semester who've been talking about the ontogenetic origins, looking at the developmental origins of this stuff and how culture impacts that. And today, because it's me, we're going to be talking a little bit about the phylogenetic origins of some of this kinds of stuff. And again, I didn't know who was going to be here, if it was just Beck people or random people, but this is something you guys don't need to see, but this is what I introduced my psychologists to, is that this is the human line over here, and we could look to all the other cool species in the primate tree to kind of get at the evolutionary origins of this stuff. And today you'll hear about two populations that we've been working with to study this question. One on the branch of New World monkeys, particularly the brown capuchin monkey. We had, up until very recently, had a social enclosure of brown capuchin monkeys, captive brown capuchin monkeys that we studied at Yale University. They came from Franz de Waal's lab, but the captive setting is going to allow us to do a lot of the cool experimental manipulations that you'll see, trying to look at the origins of economic biases. So that's kind of one population you'll hear from. But we also kind of study a different branch of primates, even more closely related to humans, on the Old World monkey branch. These guys are rhesus macaques who don't live in the lab. They live out at a field reserve that some of you know quite well, which is Cayo Santiago, an island off the coast of Puerto Rico. It's a small-ish island, but it's relevant for us because it has about 1,000-ish free-ranging monkeys who kind of run around living naturalistically, doing their monkey thing. But they're pretty habituated to people being around them pretty closely, and we can do subtle manipulations, and so we can set up cognition studies out there, even though these guys are free-ranging, to kind of test what they know about the world. So those are the two populations we'll be studying, and because I'm a psychologist, what I'm interested in is whether or not these guys think and use the same kinds of representations about the world as we do. And typically, comparative psychology tends to study whether or not other non-human species, particularly non-human primates, kind of are, in some sense, have some of the smarter cognitive capacities that humans have, right? We study things like the origins of tool use or things like theory of mind and so on. We take this kind of relatively smart capacity that humans have, and we ask whether or not non-human primates have the same proximate mechanisms. It's less often done to kind of take the flip of this version, which is to take some of the not so smart things that adult humans do, some of the kind of irrational behaviors or the biases, and to try to study the evolutionary origins of those. But we got to thinking that this might be really important for a couple of reasons. One is that we really want to understand the biases that adult humans are walking around with, because we might want to come up with good ways to fix them and make them not as kind of biased and as paramount. But with our evolutionary hat on, these kinds of biases raise important questions. Economists and psychologists talk about these things as irrationalities, systematic deviations from normativity. And if they're so systematically deviant, we might not expect to see them as robustly across cultures as we sometimes do. And so I think taking an evolutionary approach to studying some of our evolutionary biases is important, because we kind of want to explain these things that look like they might not be normative, and particularly to try to look at them in non-human primates. And so that was what we were up to. And a couple years ago, we started looking at this in one domain that's been studied a bunch by psychologists. And that's to try to see if some of the kind of classic judgment and decision-making biases that you see in behavioral economics could be present in non-human primates. And I'm using the term we, and I don't mean the royal we. I mean in collaboration with two collaborators, Keith Chen, who's now your colleague here at the UCLA School of Management, who's an economist, and Venkat Lakshminarayanan, who is a grad student in the lab. But what we decided to do was to say of all the different judgment and decision-making biases, if we're going to kind of look at them experimentally in non-human animals, where should we start? And we started with a set of classic biases that come from the literature on human framing effects, which I'll explain in a second. But basically, the upshot of these effects is that when you think about economic choices, as an adult human, you tend to be pretty biased in the way that your preferences work. And a lot of this work came from the behavioral economist Danny Kahneman and his partner Amos Tversky. If you want a fantastic crash course in this sort of behavioral economic stuff, you should check out Danny's recent book, Thinking Fast and Slow. But here's just kind of one tidbit of the kinds of framing effects we were looking at. And it's kind of a survey that he gave to Princeton undergraduates. I'll give it to you so you can kind of get a sense of how this works. But here's going to be one of your biases in action so that you can see how the framing effects work. So imagine that the Beck Institute got a lot more money. I could run a study now, or I could give each of you $1,000, right? And it helps to truly play along, right? Really, if you got a windfall at this moment of $1,000, what would you do with it, right? But the story gets even better because now you're going to have the opportunity to make more money. You get a choice of how to do that. One option is that you get to take a risk. I'm going to flip a coin, and if it comes up heads, you get $1,000 more. But tails is bad. Tails means you get nothing. So that's option number one. Option number two is that you could just take an extra $500 from the Beck Foundation for free. You don't have to flip a coin. And so here's more audience participation part. How many of you go with taking a risk? Show of hands. How many go with playing it safe? Show of hands. You're just like Princeton undergraduates. Different codes show the same effect. People tend in this scenario to be risk averse. That's not necessarily an irrational bias. That's just we don't like to take on extra risk when we don't have to. What is biased, and what has been called the framing effect, is what happens when I give you exactly the same final outcomes with a subtle different framing of how they're presented. So imagine this time that I was to offer you guys each $2,000. This seems twice as good, but now your choice is over how to lose some money, right? You have to give some of it back, but you get a choice. You could take a risk. This time I flip a coin, and heads is you're going to lose $1,000 of the money. Tails is that you lose nothing, so this time tails is good. Or you could just give some of the money back safely. You just give the $500 back. And now I'm measuring a different dependent measure, which somebody needs to study, which is smirking, which is, I think, our own reaction to our own irrationality. Because if you're like Princeton subjects, now this option to take a risk is seeming pretty good. This opportunity to not lose any money seems awesome. And this is weird, of course, because you guys are fast with math. You can tell that the scenarios are giving you exactly the same expected outcome, and they're kind of exactly the same stuff. So why do our intuitions change? Well, there's a couple different biases at work here. One is that you seem to set reference points. You care whether you started with $1,000 or $2,000. And the other thing is that you tend to be biased against losses. You dislike losing money so much that you end up taking on more risk than you would expect in this scenario. And so this has been labeled in the psychological literature as showing these kinds of framing effects. You frame the problem relative to some reference point, and you care where you come out at the end based on it, even though the outcomes are the same. And so what we wanted to do was to see whether we could look at qualitatively similar framing effects in non-human primates, in particular in this case in our captive capuchin monkeys. And in an ideal world, what we would be able to do is to give capuchin monkeys exactly the same choices that you got, right? Really gambles that involve some sort of financial resource where we could kind of test their intuitions about what their preferences were. And usually I have to tell this to psychologists that capuchins don't use money. You guys study capuchins in the wild, so you know this, but they don't really do this, right? So we had to use a sort of experimental trick, and the trick we used was to try to see if we could introduce these captive monkeys to their own currency and to see if they would use that in anything like the same way as the fiat currency we use for money. And we had known before we started this that there was some work that Capuchins would trade tokens for types of things, but we had no idea whether they did that in any way that looked like humans using money. But we tried it, and surprisingly, it just kind of worked. And so what we did was to introduce monkeys in this enclosure to these little tokens. The monkeys live in a big social group. When they get hungry, they can kind of come out in a tunnel by themselves. And when we first started this work, we just left a bunch of these tokens on the floor of their enclosure. And Capuchins are curious guys, so they kind of pick them up. Standing there is an experimenter who's holding food in a dish. And the Capuchins quickly got that if they kind of handed over this token, the person would give them the food. They did this relatively quickly. In about 10 trials, they kind of got how this worked. And so here's just a video of what this looks like when the Capuchins do this. They kind of get good at trading these tokens for pieces of food. And so Capuchins learned on this individually with single traders, but then we asked whether or not we could put them in some sense into a bit of a monkey market to try to see if they could make decisions over different traders who sold different foods at different rates. And even though the Capuchins were only trained on trading with one trader, we got them to make choices in this kind of market. And so here's how this worked. Each monkey comes in and they get their little wallet of 12 tokens. And importantly now, there's going to be 2 different experimenters who are trading with the monkeys. And they're different actual individuals in the lab who are wearing different clothing. So they kind of signal that they're different people. And they sell different foods at different prices. And the way we signal the price to the monkey is that the monkey is always going to hand over 1 token, but we can change the amount and the kind of food. So just by giving a bigger piece of food, in some sense, we're making that food cheaper, right? And so the way that this works is monkeys come in, they get their little wallet of tokens. The 2 traders are going to kind of pop up on either side of the monkey's enclosure. They're going to show the monkey what they're going to trade for 1 piece of food. They kind of place it there. The monkey is going to make his choice, meaning he hands over 1 token. That trader gives the food, and then this keeps going till the monkeys spend their entire budget, right? And what we were interested in is whether or not, in some sense, this market was working, where the monkey is paying attention to things like expected value and risk and all the stuff that they should be, if it's really going to work anything like the fiat currency we see in humans. And so here's just one experiment we presented the monkeys with. So imagine you're a monkey and you come in with your tokens and you meet Kirk. Kirk is holding in his dish a single grape, which is good because the monkeys like grapes a lot. So that's what's your option on one side of the enclosure. Your option on the other side of the enclosure is experimenter purple. This is Justin. You can see he's holding 2 grapes. So the question is, who should the monkey shop at, right? And here's just a little video of what this looks like. It's kind of a monkey eye height, so the experimenters' heads are cut off. This is her monkey height. But here's Honey. She's kind of waiting for this market to open, and here's her choice. And you can see she kind of correctly shops at this guy. And what we find is that most of our monkeys show this with about 10 trials of training on each experimenter at rates of about 90%. They shop at the guy who's giving the better expected value. We found also that they could track across risk. So if people did different things on different trials, they could compute an expected value and they shop kind of correctly given that exposure there. The upshot is that what we were seeing is that in this kind of experimental market context, the monkeys were doing lots of things that looked like what humans were doing with their fiat currency. But that wasn't why we started this. What we wanted to do was just to have an experimental method where we could get at the monkey's willingness to pay and try to see if they had these framing effects. And so what we're really interested in is whether they would ignore things like expected value when the options were framed a little bit differently. And so to test that, what we did was to put the monkeys in exactly that same scenario that you guys started with. We're going to be giving them differences across risky and safe options that are framed a little bit differently. And so here's the monkey's choice that looks like that first scenario you did. The monkeys come in and they meet Vlad and Wesley, who each look like they're going to give a single grape, but the monkeys are going to get bonuses that they don't expect, right? And so Vlad is a safe bonus. Every single trial, 100% of the time, when the monkey trades with him, he adds 1 grape to give the monkeys 2. So he's kind of like, it's like getting the $500 safely. Wesley is a risky bonus. 50% of the trials, he just gives the 1 grape as promised. But then the other half of the trials, he gives 3, right? And so obviously expected value is the same across these 2 experimenters. Wesley is risky and Vlad is safe. Do the monkeys show a preference? What we find is that they tend to shop at Vlad. I'll show you the exact data in a second. But overall, they tend to kind of shop at the safe guy, which again might make sense. Maybe the monkeys are just a little bit risk averse. To really show that they show the framing effect, what we have to do is to see whether the monkeys switch their preferences when the experimenters are framed as losses, as you guys did in that second scenario. And the joke in the lab is that nobody likes to be the jerk that takes away food from monkeys, but you have to do it for science. But so here's what the losses condition looked like. The monkeys are interacting, in this case, with Alex and Venkat. They each look like they're going to give the monkey 3 grapes, but they take some away. Alex is a safe loss, so every single trial he takes 1 away to give the monkeys 2. Venkat is a risky loss. Sometimes he just gives the monkeys all 3, but half the time, 50% of the time, he takes 2 away to give the monkeys 1, right? So we're giving the monkeys the same choice across risk and safe and the same expected value across both. Last time, monkeys chose to shop at the safe experimenter, but this time what we find is that just like humans, the monkeys shift their preference to shop at the guy who's being risky. In some sense, they're sort of so loss averse that they take on more risk than they would expect. Just so you can see the data, here's plotting how often the monkeys choose the risky experimenter. And the blue is that first scenario and the gains, and the orange is the losses. And I think 2 things to note about the graph. One is that even though we're just testing 5 monkeys, we do see tremendous individual differences. People often want to know what's going on with this guy here. This is our alpha male, and he's risk-seeking in both cases, which I think is very interesting. But even he, so the second thing to note is that even he is showing this framing effect. In other words, even he is getting more risk-seeking when he's dealing with losses than with gains, right? And so the upshot is that what we found in this case is that the monkeys were showing this kind of classic framing effect. And in this and a bunch of studies that I won't have a chance to tell you about because I kind of wanted to get to stuff that was more relevant for cultural learning and so on, what we're seeing is that they're showing the same kind of classic decision biases as humans show. One is that they seem to show hints of what I called reference dependence. So they care what you started with. They're not thinking in terms of absolutes. They're thinking about relative changes from a reference point. And in addition, they tend to be a little bit loss averse. They avoid cases where they seem to be getting losses even when expected value is equated. And beyond that, the combination of those 2 allows them to show what in the behavioral economics literature has been called a reflection effect. This is just this idea that you get more risk-seeking with losses than gains, exactly that pattern of data that you showed before. This is the stuff you just saw. We've also seen that monkeys tend to show other kinds of interesting decision-making biases, such as what's called an endowment effect. They overvalue goods that they have in their possession versus ones that they can get. Even with recent work, we've shown that they care a lot about outcomes that tend to be big and unexpected. And so the possibility of getting a large bonus messes them up and causes them to choke under pressure in a lot of the same ways that humans do. And basically the upshot of our research program, which I'm kind of summarizing really fast here, is that we find some effect in humans in the behavioral economics literature. We look in our capuchin monkeys in this market, and they would show something that was not just qualitatively, but in many cases quantitatively similar with what we saw in humans. The one spot where we started seeing differences, though, happened when we started looking at so-called pricing effects in non-human primates. And this is going to be the kind of shift to some of these social biases that I think will be more relevant for those of you guys who think about culture and cultural learning. So first off, what is a pricing effect? Well, a pricing effect is the idea that we like to think that our evaluation of lots of goods is just based on how that good tastes or the actual quality of those goods. But it turns out that our preferences for different kinds of items, particularly kind of luxury good items, can be swayed by an irrelevant factor, namely what its purchase price is. And so if I were to give you a sip of this bottle of wine and I were to tell you that it's a $10 bottle of wine, that same bottle of wine would taste less good to you than if I told you that the sip was coming from a $100 bottle of wine, the exact same bottle of wine, right? Just to see some actual data, here's some data by the neuroeconomist Hilke Plassman and her colleagues. She measured ratings of subject liking for the same wine, so each of these different colors is the same wine, when subjects are told different price points. So if you think the blue wine is $5, you like it about a 2. When you think the same blue wine is $45, then you like it about a 3.5. You can double, in some cases, subjects' preferences just by kind of lying to them and telling them information about the price. You might think these are just like undergrads trying to seem cool and say they like expensive wine and so on, but you can get even more detailed measures of these kinds of effects. Plassman, in part because she's a neuroscientist, is able to study reward processing in the brain while subjects are making these decisions. And this is showing an fMRI picture of activation in the orbital frontal cortex. This is the area of your brain that would fire if I gave you I don't know, something really rewarding like a big hit of money or looking at attractive people in photos or a big burst of cocaine or something really good. And what you find is that when you're studying subjects' reactions in those areas of the orbital frontal cortex, the very same taste of wine will taste differently depending on subjects' perception of the price. So when subjects think this wine is $10, here's firing this region, and actually you see decrease in firing in the region. But when subjects think the wine is $90, you see more and increase and more sustained firing, right? So it's not just like that we kind of say it's a little bit better. Really, our reward areas seem to be like thinking it's better to some rich sense. So you see these kinds of pricing effects across all kinds of contexts effects in humans. And what we wanted to see was whether or not we could see these things in our capuchin monkeys. And the neat thing was that we were able to test this in a cool way with our monkey market method, in part because we had done a bunch of studies. This is me saying the we again. So the we in studying pricing effects was mostly with Ria Catapano, who is an undergrad who did this work for her thesis, and a bunch of other awesome collaborators who helped on this. But in part, we knew we could do this because we had shown in our original monkey market studies that the monkeys were tracking some information about the price of these different goods in their market, tracking them so much that we could model the monkeys' preferences using the kinds of models that economists use, using what's called the generalized axiom of revealed preferences. The same thing that explained how we shift prices as prices change was explaining the monkey's choice behavior. And so just to get a sense of how one of these studies works, here's the one that we did for this new study. We're giving the monkeys choices this time between different goods. And in part because these pricing effects worked best in the context of different brands of things, we decided to see if we could show the monkeys different kind of brands of things. And so the monkeys are making choices between two boxes that include little pieces of cereal. And the boxes are distinguished by different pictures on the front of the boxes. Just to make it easier for the monkeys, we also put the pictures on the shirts of the different experimenters, and so the monkeys could kind of distinguish. But they get pieces of food from these little different brands. It's the same kind of food, so the ultimate stuff is the same. And we first sell these to the monkeys at exactly the same price. So monkeys get one box of food per token, right? We look at their preferences across those two brands in case the monkeys have some preference. And then what we do is we change the price of one of the brands. Basically, we're shifting so that now the monkeys, for a single token, can buy 3 boxes of the flour cereal, right? And what we had seen previously is the monkeys shift their consumption to the other brand of cereal. They buy more when it's cheaper. But interestingly, they do that in ways that the economic models predict. So they shift as much as you might expect. And so the key here is that we've now just made this one much more expensive. That one's cheap. And the idea is, do the monkeys shop more at the cheap one? Because that's where they get more food, right? And we've seen in this brand study and a bunch of other studies that the monkeys perform about like this. I'm going to plot how often the monkeys go to the cheap good at the end, so the good that would eventually be cheap. Here's what happens when the goods are the same price. They show a little bit of a preference, but not really. Now when you make one good cheap, basically all the monkeys shop almost exclusively at that good, right? They're getting more food there, right? But to the extent that they're understanding the price in the same way as humans are, what we wanted to ask was, does the different price information affect the monkey's valuation? In other words, even though they're buying more of the cheap one, if they had their druthers and they could just have these goods for free, would they in some sense like the one that they saw as more expensive more, right? And so here was how we asked that. We introduced the monkeys to 2 new brands. This time we didn't give them a choice. They kind of just had to shop at one person, so they spend all their money on one person. So you're a monkey, you come in, and you're like, oh, this is this new brand of stuff. This is horseshoe, and you only get like 1 horseshoe, so you're like, wow, horseshoe brand is really expensive. Then on the next day you come in, you just get to shop at Moon, and you're like, wow, Moon's really cheap. I get like 3 of them. Next day you go back to the horseshoe. You're like, wow, it's really expensive. Now you get Moon. Basically, we give the monkeys 6 different sessions of 12 trials with each of these guys to learn the price. And then the monkeys come in, and it's a little bit different. They don't have their tokens there. And so here's the analogy, right, for you guys. So imagine you go to the wine shop, and you look at the different prices of different wines, and every day you see the like $100 bottle of Pinot Noir that you look at in the wine shop. But many of you are grad students, so you walk away from that bottle, and then you go get the $5 like $2 chuck that you get, right? But now imagine that you come to the Beck Center and we're having a big reception, right? And you just get to have the wines for free. And there's your $2 chuck, and there's the $100 bottle of wine. But you don't have to pay for it. Which one do you choose, right? And so functionally, this is what we're doing to the monkeys. They come in and there's no tokens. They're like, what's going on? There's just a big buffet of the different brands of these cereals, and the monkeys just get to eat them without having to pay for anything. And the question is, would they do what you probably would? Would they selectively pick the expensive one now that they don't have to pay for it anymore, right? Would they, in some sense, be confusing the value of this thing for its nominal price with like how really good it is, right? And so this time I'm going to give you 2 bars, the monkey's choice to the cheap good and the expensive good across the different monkeys. And here was what we found in our first test of this. And this was the first time that we were seeing that monkeys were just kind of not showing the same bias as humans were. They were pretty much at chance across which ones they picked, which was interesting. And so we said, we weren't expecting that, so as you do as you're a good scientist, you do it again. So we replicated this with different cheap and expensive brands. The monkeys still showed chance performance. We said, maybe this brand was a crazy idea. They're capuchins after all. Like, let's give them real foods. And so we tried cheap and expensive versions of new foods that the monkeys hadn't had before. Monkeys were still at chance. So maybe something about the weirdness of this is going on. So we introduced the monkeys to cheap and expensive familiar foods but they never bought them in the market. And we still saw no effect. The monkeys were kind of just a chance on this. Yeah.
Do the foods taste different from one another in each of these different experiments?
We did them both ways. So the first brands we did were exactly the same food. Then we said, let's make the food look different, but be different brands. And so we gave the monkeys little pieces of Jell-O that we could dye to look different, but we knew they tasted and calorically were the same. We did this both with different. Basically, the upshot was that they just didn't show. Yeah, it wasn't. We thought maybe it's the same food, right? But it turns out even if you make it different or same calorically but looking different, it's just like. We did it 7 different ways and got a bunch of nulls. But poor undergrad senior thesis, we're just like, am I going to be able to publish this? And I'm like, I hope so. No effect. But the hope is we did it enough that we're like, they're just not showing these effects. And in every single case, in the control case where they had to know about the price, they knew about the price, right? They were tracking these different brands. They just weren't showing the same effect. And so the upshot is it seemed like the capuchin monkeys weren't affected by price in the same way that humans were. They weren't confusing price and value. And so we said, why is that? Why are they not showing this effect? And so one possibility was that the monkeys had just a completely different learning situation in what they knew about prices than what humans did, right? Humans grow up in this domain where prices are determined in some sense by supply and demand, right? So you couldn't charge a crazy price for a bottle of wine if it tasted terrible. We kind of implicitly pick up on this stuff, and therefore we kind of assume more expensive things are better, and that's because sometimes typically they are in our experience in the learning environment that we have in our market. That could be partially true. Of course, we set the prices for the monkeys, right? There's not really monkey supply and demand. But the problem is that doesn't really predict the domains in which you see this pricing effect in humans. In fact, if you really look at which goods are more valuable, it's not clear that more valued goods actually always cost. It's not clear that the learning effect in humans is really there either. And so we thought maybe that's what's going on, but that doesn't fully explain the effect in humans either. But then we started thinking more to think that maybe something else was different about the way the monkeys were thinking about their goods. And to see that, I'll kind of give you this image, which is kind of an analogy. So allegedly, these are the most expensive wines ever purchased from winefolly.com. And this is wow, some people earn a lot more money than I do at Yale. But I think 2 things to take away from this graph. One is that I'm not sure that these price point differences would really be predicted by value and supply and demand. I'm not sure that $300,000 wine is really that many times better than my $10 bottle of wine, I don't think, right? But the second thing to take away from this graph, and the reason I love this picture, is that guy right there. So this guy is apparently Christian Vanek, who's apparently some wine expert. And I think the fact that he's in this image is very telling, because I think one of the other things that we humans get from price information, and one of the reasons we might confuse it with value, is that price information tells us something about the market demand for these things. It tells us that other expert people who have a lot more money than you, want these kinds of wines. And that might be what the monkeys are missing. In other words, they're not picking up on the fact that the price information is a social signal about who wants what. And to get a sense of price doing that, I'll show you kind of another image that I love. So this is outside the Apple store in New York when the iPhone 5 was introduced. Now, if you have the iPhone 5 and you had the iPhone 4, you know that the iPhone 5 is basically exactly the same as the iPhone 4, except it's $300 more expensive, right? The expensiveness is not telling you about all these crazy new features, but I think what the expensiveness is telling you is that all these other people want one, right? Socially, it's become very important to get the new model of the iPhone. And if the line wasn't enough, here's the first guy who came out, and people are oh, there's a lot of social prestige and support for this stuff. And so we started thinking, maybe this is what the primates aren't getting. Maybe they're not using price as a social piece of information that other people like this. And this is what launched a line of work in our lab trying to see if there could be potentially uniquely human biases for this kind of subtle social contagion, where we're taking cues from the environment about what other people like and what other people know, and that's affecting our preferences. And when we started this stuff, we started in a domain of psychology that's different from the cultural learning literature. We were looking at cases in cognitive psychology where you're just kind of, without realizing it, contagiously taking on the information that other individuals have. And one of the effects in this domain is what's become known as alter-centric interference. This is work by Ian Apperly and his colleagues who studied this in the domain of theory of mind. But the idea is that sometimes just what other people see, other people's perspective, can kind of mess you up in these interesting ways. And so to see this in action, I'll kind of give you the version of the study that Apperly and colleagues used. And so your task is going to work like this. I'm going to flash up a bunch of red dots on the screen, and you have to yell out the number of those red dots. Okay? There's going to be other stuff on the screen too. Ignore that. But your task is just to yell out the number of red dots. Okay? Really, I'm going to collect them. I'm going to publish paper out. You're going to really play, right? Okay? All right, here you go. Yell them out.
1, 3, 2, 4, 3, 2.
Okay, so you got a little bit of a sense of the effect happening, right? Which is that some of you were kind of messing up, some of the numbers were off a little, like little reaction time differences and so on. And the reason you show those reaction time differences allegedly has to do with the other thing on the screen, which is like this random guy. Questions, why is the random guy on the screen? Turns out that if I measure your reaction time to correctly say 2 to this event, when this guy's perspective is 2, he sees them both, you are in fact faster and more accurate than if I were to give you a case of 2 that looked like this. I saw that on one of the ones that was like 3, and some of you were saying 2 because the guy could see 2, right? And so this is what Apperly and colleagues measure. He gives cases of exactly the same number when the person in the screen, who's just some cartoon on the screen's perspective is consistent with yours. And what you find is that you're more accurate and faster to answer in this case than you are in that case. Yeah,
Is that
Aaron.
control for how far apart the dots are?
Yep, so he tries to move them apart, and it controls for numerical distance. And so he gets this neat numerical distance effect of how off you are from the other person's perspective, which is cool. So you're kind of Weber functioning your other person's perspective. They're like tiny, they're tiny, tiny, tiny effects, but it seems like you're kind of messed up by what this other person, you're automatically pressing what he sees, and you're kind of messed up by
And
it.
the control condition would have the eyes facing forward, so you're not biased by that?
He doesn't do that, he does it with an inanimate thing.
So there's a whole bunch of work in object perception where if you have 2 objects on the screen, and then you have 2 dots on separate objects, it's harder, it takes longer to count them up than if they're both on the same object.
I see. I don't think he's,
Visual
yeah. I know. I don't think he's done the object. So it's an effect that was kind of, it came out in 2010. Folks are now following up on it. There's all these other predictions and controls he needs to do. His control is not a person, it's just like an inanimate thing there. It's not eyes facing forward, which is not ideal for all the reasons I'm sure you're thinking. We're now doing some follow-ups on this where our approach is like, rather than control all the dot stuff, we're gonna mess around with who the person is, like is it an in-group member or an out-group member? And those shouldn't affect visual processing, but they should affect these to the extent that they're social effects, they should affect those. But the suggestion, at least from Ian, is that you're kind of automatically processing this person's stuff, and the other person's percept is messing you up when theirs is different than yours, right? This is alter-centric interference. There have been claims, but I should preface it with slightly more controversial claims that this happens not just in the domain of thinking about other people's perspective, but thinking about other people's beliefs. So this is a study by Agnes Kovacs and her colleagues. She's done this with adult human undergraduates, but she's also done it with very young infants, and because there's an infant video, I'll show you the infant version. But here's the task. Basically, we're going to be doing one of these tasks where we're measuring where the baby thinks this yellow ball is. The ball's going to go back and forth behind the occluder, and the occluder is going to fall, and we're going to ask if the baby thinks it's there. And there's tons of work in developmental psychology suggesting that if an object is behind an occluder and it disappears, babies will kind of look longer at that event than the object being there. So we're going to use the dependent measure of the babies looking at these events to distinguish between them. The key, though, is that we're going to see whether or not the baby's belief about the location of the object is affected by this kind of Smurf character's belief about the location of the object, right? And so here's the event that the babies see. They see the ball kind of moving back and forth, and it goes behind the occluder, so the baby and the Smurf should believe that the object's there. But when the Smurf is away and not paying attention, the baby gets privileged access to the fact that the ball is leaving. And so now, when the Smurf comes back and the screen falls down, this should be a kind of boring expected event for the baby, but the Smurf should kind of find this in some sense of violation. And what Kovacs and colleagues find is that babies seem to show longer looking on behalf of the Smurf's belief. In other words, because the Smurf didn't think it's there, the babies are somehow like surprised that it's not there either. You can do this same sort of effect in adult humans using the kind of task I told you, where it's like a detection task, an object detection task, and what you find is that people are facilitated and more accurate when the object's there and the person believed it's there. Again, for some like crazy cartoon Smurf on the screen. So folks are now replicating this kind of finding. It's a bit controversial, but the claim is that you can get something like belief interference. Like when you're hanging out with somebody whose belief is different than yours, it affects your ability to act on your own belief, at least in these kind of localized, tiny sorts of tasks, right? And so we take these to be kind of cases that show that people are kind of have these like very dumb mechanisms to have other people's kind of mental content interfere with their own. And so we wanted to see, these are like really basic object detection kinds of tasks. We wanted to see whether we could do the same thing in non-human primates. And we turned this time to the Kaio monkeys, in part because we've done lots of studies using similar sorts of methods with the Kaio monkeys. We can kind of measure their looking at different sorts of outcomes to try to see whether they detect violations as well. And so just to give you a quick sense, though, it could be that the non-human primates mess this up because they just don't like care about anybody else's mental content other than their own. But we have data in this population suggesting that they do process information relevant to what other people see and what other people know. So here's just some early work we did looking at this. Here's just an experiment to see if the monkeys know some information about what a human sees. Both of these humans are standing in front of platforms with grapes, and monkeys are hungry monkeys on Kaio, who like to take food but kind of don't want to do that in a detected way. And the question is whether or not they selectively steal from the person who's not going to know that they're stealing. Do they steal from the person who can't see them? And what we found in this and a bunch of other studies is the monkeys are really good at that. Even in first trial performance, they steal from the guy who can't see, even when the seeing is kind of messed up by these subtle things. So they're kind of tracking what people can see. And using methods that are similar, we've shown that the monkeys make correct predictions based on what people know and don't know. And so here's where we're going to kind of introduce this looking measure that we do at Kaio, where we're using the monkey's duration of looking as a measure of their expectations. And here's the sort of the setup. We're going to be asking about the monkey's expectations about where this person's going to look for the object that they've just seen moving around, right? Just so you get a sense of how this works at the field site. These are the different parts of the study. You have one person who's acting as the presenter. They're going to be kind of watching this object and acting. And then you have the monkey, who's the subject, who's about this far from it, kind of watching her do this stuff. Behind her, you have a camera person who's filming the monkey really tightly on his face and is blind to the different conditions. And what we're going to do is going to ask whether the monkey's expectations in terms of their looking differ depending on what the person does. Does she like reach where the object's supposed to be, or does she reach in a weird spot? Right? And so here are the conditions we gave in this one case. The monkey's watching, and the monkey sees the person see the object move into the white box. And the question is, where does she reach for it? If I were asking you, you would find this pretty expected because she just like looked at that object, and you would see this event as kind of weird, like why did she reach into the other one? And what we find is that the monkeys show the same effect. If you show them these two events, they watch that one for longer than they do this one. Incidentally, this is the same thing that 15-month-old human babies do. They kind of expect people to act where objects are, that they've seen them. So it seems like they're tracking information about seeing, but it does seem like the monkeys aren't as good at tracking information about what other individuals believe, right? And so here's just how we set that up. The monkeys see April watching this object go back and forth into the green box. And then once the object's inside the green box, the monkeys, but not April, get privileged access to the fact that the object went to the white box, right? And so the question is, where should April reach? Well, you would find this one expected because you know that she has a different belief than you do. But you might be confused and think, well, maybe she's going to reach here because that's where the object is. What you find is that 15-month-old human babies find this event expected and look longer at this event. What we find in the monkeys, though, is that the monkeys don't distinguish between these two events. In fact, they show short looking at both of them. And what this suggests is that the monkeys are tracking the fact that the person's ignorant. They know something different happened in this case than in the other case, but they're not correctly predicting her belief. Right? And so this is just kind of background work suggesting that the monkeys are tracking certain kinds of information about what people do. And what we wanted to see was whether or not they would contagiously track the kind of stuff we saw in this case. So we originally designed this study as a kind of easy test of false beliefs in the monkeys because we thought this is a case where even very young 7-month-old babies are succeeding, kind of just, they're so implicitly processing other people's belief that it kind of subtly messes them up. They don't have to make predictions. And so we wanted to see whether or not the monkeys could do this. And this time the we is me with a former postdoc, Alia Martin. And here's the monkey version of that Smurf test. Now the Smurf is Alia, and she's watching an apple go back and forth in these two boxes. And in all cases, the apple is going to do something, but the relevant end of the event in all the cases is nothing on the stage. That box falls, and it's empty, right? So in this case, it would have been kind of boring. Both Alia and the monkey saw it go here. It falls, and it's supposed to be empty. But we can kind of set up the different versions of all the cells to see if Alia's belief is similar to the monkey's. And so here's how we do that. This is the one you just saw. Alia and the monkey see this go there. And then when the thing falls, it's kind of boring. And so both the monkey and Alia have a true belief. They shouldn't be surprised. Then we could set up the especially surprising case. So Alia and the monkey see it go into the right one, but then it falls and it's empty. So now both the monkey should be surprised by this, but Alia should also have a false belief by this. And then we can do the more interesting ones where the Alia and the monkey have different beliefs. So here's one where Alia thinks it's in the box, and then she's hidden, and the monkey can see it's empty. So now when this falls, the monkey thinks it's empty, but Alia should be surprised, right? That's kind of the interesting one. And then just because we're filling out all the cells, we have one where Alia has a true belief, but the monkey doesn't. So Alia sees the object go in there, but the monkey thinks it's in there, and then we can have the thing fall, right? And so the question is whether what the monkeys do on this case, when Alia has the same belief as them, is different than in those cases. And what we find is this, which is that we get a nice effect based on what the monkey thinks should happen. So in all the cases where the monkey's belief has been violated, so they didn't expect the object to be there, the monkeys show longer looking. We get that statistical difference. What we don't see is any of the effects that you see in adult humans and in human babies. We don't see is that the agent's belief is affecting the monkeys at all. They just don't care. Even though they make correct predictions about humans on exactly the same task, they kind of just don't care when the person's belief is violated. But we said maybe this is just about beliefs. Beliefs are these mental representations that we know are pretty complicated even for humans. How about this like dumber case of just object detection and alter-centric interference? And so what we did was to do a monkey version of that same study, and this time the we is in collaboration with Alia, but also Lindsay Drayton, who's a fantastic grad student of mine. But we did as a kind of, I don't have the picture, but we have the kind of Apple version of this stuff that I just showed you. We habituate the monkeys to objects in this display like this. And then in our case, we do counterbalance how far the objects move, but we give the monkeys different cases where always the objects move the same amount, but they do it in a different way. So one is the case where the objects move, but ultimately the number that the agent and the monkey see end up being the same. So like the objects move, but the monkey still sees 2 and the agent still sees 2. We do one case where the thing that the agent sees is the same, but the monkey's number has changed. So that's just to detect that the monkeys are doing it, but the agent is the same. We do one where what the monkeys saw is the same, but the agent is different, right? So the monkeys shouldn't be surprised there's still 2 things there, but the agent should. And then we do one where both change, so the number changes for the monkey and the agent. And again, the question is going to be, does the monkey is going to be tracking the number himself. We know the monkeys can detect differences between 1 and 2 objects on this task. That they differentially detect this number change depending on what the person has seen, kind of like you just did in that alter-centric interference study. And here's what we find, basically the same effect as we saw before. The monkeys, when his perspective is changing, in other words, he's seeing less objects than he saw before, he is increasing his looking, but he's not doing that differentially depending on what the human does. And so the upshot of all of these cases is in these like basic tasks of kind of this contagious information that you get from others, we're not seeing the monkeys showing these same kinds of patterns as we see in humans of very different ages. They're not kind of automatically picking up on the information that others have. And the question is kind of, what are the consequences of this? Could this be something like a human unique social contagion that affects our behavior? Well, it probably doesn't affect our behavior that much if it's just about like different objects in different spots and different beliefs about that stuff. But if it could be different beliefs about richer things like how to use some artifact or how normatively we do things, then these kinds of dumb processes might impact big differences that we see across humans and primates. And I'll end with kind of one of these potential big differences. It's not work that's coming out of our lab, but work out of Andy Whiten's lab and others. This is work just trying to look at how you socially transmit information about how to open different stuff. And in this case, they're going to be comparing how human children do that with how chimpanzees do that. And what I want you to think about as you see this is kind of how those mechanisms of social contagion might play out in a task that works like this. And so here's the task. Your problem is you have to figure out how to open this puzzle box. You don't know how it works because it's opaque, because like it's got things, but you could, I don't know, try different stuff. Luckily for you, you have a social agent who's going to teach you. And so here's Vicky Horner doing this for the chimps. And she's showing him how to do it. And you can see it's much more elaborate than you might have guessed. You apparently have to like move these different things out of the way and use the stick at the top. And then after that, you can get out a treat, which is a starburst, oddly enough. But one thing that Vicky Horner and colleagues found is that chimpanzees seeing this event, when they don't know how to open the box, will kind of pretty slavishly copy it, right? So they'll follow her movements pretty well. They'll move the things, use the stick, and then open up the box eventually. And perhaps not surprising, 3 to 4-year-old children will do the same thing. Kids who saw that same event will copy pretty slavishly as well, doing all the different parts of it. And all of this, it makes sense to kind of copy this person's behavior in this case because you yourself do not have a belief about how to open the box. right? It's opaque, like you don't know. And so it seems totally reasonable that your belief about how to open the box could be to do all this extra stuff, right? But what if you did have a reasonable belief about how to open the box? What if instead of being opaque, the box was transparent and you could see that there was just kind of a false top at the top and just air, and the only thing relevant to do is this little opaque thing that's a door, right? The idea is you would have a really rich belief how to solve it, you would just open the door. But you now get evidence that somebody else has a different belief. You see somebody come in and do all these elaborate steps, even though to your belief it is just dumb. The question is, would that person's belief affect yours? And since it's Vicky's study, I'll show you what Vicky said. I don't have the audio on, but hopefully it's loud enough so you can hear.
The second box that I show the chimpanzees is this one, and it's identical to the opaque box, except that it's made out of material which is see-through.
Only now is it obvious that the tapping and poking don't achieve a thing. The box has a false ceiling.
And so you're a chimp, you've just seen this, you're smart enough physically to figure out how the box works. The idea is, does the other person's belief about how the box works affect you? Since Vicky's study, I'll show you what they found.
The chimps cut to the chase. They skip the needless steps. For the apes, it is all about the treat.
Right, it makes sense not to have your beliefs messed up by somebody else's dumb beliefs. But of course, the reason I'm telling you this, and many of you in the room who study this stuff know, is that kids do something very different in this case. And so here's what kids do for those that don't know.
We found something quite surprising. The children were predisposed to copy, even when it meant that they were doing something that was really rather silly. So this seems a little like the chimps are outsmarting the kids in this particular study.
There he is. You got him out.
And so while we don't yet know if these kinds of social contagion mechanisms are the kind of thing that's mediating this sort of behavior, which researchers have referred to as over-imitation, I think the tantalizing hint is that there may be some really basic mechanisms about how you process what other individuals know that are present in humans, but at least from testing rhesus macaques, we know are not present in macaques, and the prediction is not present in other primates. Yeah.
Does this over-imitation depend on the demonstrator being right there with the child?
Mm-hmm. Really good question. And so the other guy who's in the video, who's not Vicky Horn or Andy White, and he is Derek Lyons, who is a grad student at Yale. And that was exactly the thing he said. He was like, this is just the kid following what the instructor said. And so he did two things. One is he did this same task where the person was out of the room. And the second thing he did was he tried to convince the child that she wasn't in an experiment anymore. Like, so not just no audience effects, but like it's not an experiment, just like, and so the way he did that, I have the video at the end, which I can show you if you want to see. The way he does that is he convinces the child that there's some emergency happening. So they do the whole thing, he shows them how to do stuff. They never get to act on the box. He gives the child the prize, they do something else, the experiment's over. At the end, he says, oh no, there's like another kid coming, like I have to go deal with the other kid, but I have this inept research assistant and she forgets to put the candy in the box. Like I have to run, but can you just check, make sure there's candy in the box and come tell me if there's no candy. He leaves, and what you find is that at least in that case, the kids imitate just as much if he's not in the room. And so he's also done some stuff to interview the kids about the physical, like what they think about the box, and he'll anecdotally get kids saying, you can't open it, it would be physically stuck in there if you didn't open it. Since that time, folks have done a lot more work on this sort of task. It is true that the audience effects bump it up more, but it seems like you don't need just the audience there to show that kind of effect. Yeah. But my prediction, which might be not empirically true, we need more data to find out, is that we are irresistibly drawn to the beliefs of others in part because of these dumb mechanisms. That if we're kind of constantly getting interference from other people's beliefs, it might be easy to show these kinds of things beyond all the kind of social demand characteristics and all the other rich stuff that's probably playing into. But anyway, so the conclusion is that if we go back to our primate tree with Stephen Colbert, the idea is what we've been trying to do is to see if some of the kinds of biases we see in the basic mechanisms for those biases that we see in humans are present in other non-human primates. And what we found in our earlier work, and a ton of work on economic biases, is that many of those standard classic framing effects and biases are true pretty distantly across the primate order, right? We see them in capuchins who have very different experiences. However, in the context of a lot of these sort of social, quote unquote, social biases that we don't see them in capuchin monkeys, and some we don't see in rhesus macaques, and at least these over-imitation kinds of biases you don't see in chimpanzees as well, suggesting that we might have very basic mechanisms for social contagion that might be unique to the human species, or at least unique to the human line. And I think that has lots of implications for the kinds of cultural learning that many of you in this room study. But I'll end with kind of where we're going with this work, which is that we've been really fascinated by this idea of biases for social contagion, and thus far it seems like primates might not be great models for this. And so what we've wanted to do, because in part a lot of my interest in this is to study what parts of these are unique to humans, is to turn to a species that might be more interested in watching human behavior and might be kind of prone to copying and having mechanisms for contagion that you might expect in conspecifics, and that is the domesticated dog. And so we've just started Yale's first canine cognition center, where folks from the community bring their dogs in, and we can do all kinds of studies. And right now we're doing all studies on social contagion kinds of biases, the imitation task that you saw, as well as other kinds of things. And what we'll be able to find out is if just being a creature that's raised with conspecifics, with selection pressures to pay attention to this stuff, gives rise to, say, some of basic proximate mechanisms that we see in humans. But we don't know yet. You'll have to invite me back out to the nice California weather in a few years, and we'll tell you. But this is the thank you slide I use, because I get to be this monkey who comes out to LA while my students are doing all the hard work. And you've heard about them already, but here's who they are again. So thanks. Other questions? Yeah.
So has anybody done any work on when in the course of development that effect disappears in human beings?
So the insinuation of the question is that the effect disappears, and what you know is that it disappears probably for that simple task. But if you make the task a teensy-weensy bit more causally opaque, you can even get adult humans to show this so-called over-imitation. And think to something you kind of like marginally don't know how to do, but you know there's somebody in your lab that knows how to do better. Like, you will believe all kinds of stuff. I have a student who knows R really well, and she can click every single button on my stats thing, and I'm like, okay, like I guess those are the things you click, right? And so the idea is that it doesn't go away. In some people's data sets, it can potentially get worse over development slightly. Again, we don't have like lots of folks are studying this now, so there's like new papers coming out. It's like one of those fields where there's like new papers coming out all the time. My read of the literature so far is that it's least prevalent in the youngest infants, although it's hardest to test in the youngest infants because they can't do much, and it's sort of steady across development. The other thing, just because I'm here and not in a psychology department, that people often ask is like, obviously these are like weirdo Western kids from New Haven, like, is this true broadly? There was one report doing the same study in the Kalahari in Bushman kids, and what you found is that they over-imitated at the same level as kids from California. However, I think there's a new paper that came out like just last week with one population of horticulturalists that I'm blanking on because that's not my area of expertise, that's showing that they do it, but they do it at less of a level than Western kids. And so the prediction is that there's going to be more cultural variation than people expected with this, but it seems like everybody's kind of doing it. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So back to that.
Overvaluation is a function of price. I mean, the fact that the monkeys can learn the exchange, right, and that they can understand how to maximize return on their investment doesn't mean that they understand all the dynamics of the market. And the human case, I mean, there's a big gap between the monkeys and the humans in lots of ways. So totally. There's a prestige factor, right? So you chose the wine example, and California vintners have discovered that they made a mistake initially trying to enter the Chinese market by selling affordable wines. And the reason that was a mistake is because wine was being purchased as a luxury good for conspicuous consumption, and so in fact what they needed to do was export their most expensive wine. So there's a bunch of symbolic communication that's completely independent. It's an aspect of the market in humans, but it's completely independent. And that's only one example of the kind of the complexity of consumption behavior in humans. So it seems to me that to bridge the gap, what you really need is an animal model where they have experience with markets, but there's none of the symbolic baggage that goes with human markets. So you and I were speaking earlier about cleaner fish markets, right? Now, you might expect that cleaner fish would understand both, well, there's a lot of evidence that they do have market dynamics, right? So this simple law of supply and demand clearly affects the cleaner fish, but that they would understand value, right? That price is actually, I look around me and I see what the other fish are doing. I understand, without necessarily having theory in mind or anything else, right? I understand that those who are buyers who are paying a higher price are getting something for that, and so I should expect when all options are equivalent to me to prefer the same thing that the others prefer.
And it would be, and that's one of the things where if we can get this collaboration with Red One going, that we hope that we can, it's a little bit outside kind of his interest, but the hope is that we could potentially do that. And yeah, I agree. I mean, so one thing is that we, in our market, never had cases where the monkeys were buying things that were kind of conspicuously consumed. I mean, the capuchins don't have that exactly, but you could imagine all kinds of species that do, who might show these kinds of effects. So I'm thinking of even things like, bower birds, where the bower is like boring and stupid, but or the different like weird male species where they like do something and have to be bigger and better than other males, but it's something that they have to like can trade or get value for. You might expect them to show these kinds of things where the monkeys don't. The question is whether or not the transmission, at the proximate level, the transmission of those kinds of conspicuous behaviors happens via a mechanism like this. In other words, you don't need anything to get off the ground in terms of what's valuable. It's just valuable because other people are valuing it. And so the prediction is maybe those species have something like these kinds of transmission mechanisms. We don't know. But
so I guess maybe one question that speaks to the domain generality or specificity of relevant proximate mechanisms. Whether, for example, the capuchins have imitation effects in mate valuation.
Yeah.
Because if they do, and you don't see that in your artificial market, then that suggests there's a lot of specificity there. And if they don't, right, then maybe they just are lacking building blocks that are needed.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a question not for my tiny sample of 5 capuchins, but for actual capuchins in the wild, which is why it's important. The other effect that we didn't see in them, we haven't published it because unlike this one where we saw the Snell effect a million times and had good controls, we didn't have great controls for this. And so it's hard to know whether capuchins don't care in some interesting way or it's just kind of mush, was we did a bunch of studies on scarcity preferences, which is another thing you see in human markets. I make something really scarce and everyone wants it. It's also something that you see in very young children. So Laurie Markson and her colleagues have done these cool studies on scarcity effects in kids, and you find that kids will think of things as more valuable, like a prize that's in some bag if it's scarce, right? And so we got into this thinking like that's something that they should pick up on, right? But we did it in this market context where they were choosing between goods that were scarce, total mush. We did it with a bunch of different goods, but then we did it in a way we thought like would work pretty well, which is that we had subjects watch the fact that the scarcity was being driven by not just other monkeys, but by the alpha male. So the monkeys are watching, they see him go in and him pick one of the things, and they get this sense of like, oh, that's why they're scarce, is because other monkeys have gone through the tunnel first. And then we gave them the choice. It was still mush. And that was a domain where we thought, like, they should care about other monkeys' choices generally about what's scarce is kind of good, and particularly the kind of alpha male, but we just didn't get anything. I mean, the possibility is that like they would do that if it was about mate preferences or about something in some domain that really mattered than our stupid market thing. But the fact that we weren't seeing it broadly tells us that maybe it's possible that those domain general mechanisms are really different. Like there's some accident of the fact that we're kind of processing other people's preferences. And so, great.
Yeah, sort of on those lines, with the belief tracking, knowledge tracking stuff, I was wondering about the competitive versus cooperative dimension. Right, where the old story with chimps from Povinelli was they don't pay any attention to what somebody can see, but then you put them into a competitive situation where they can use that for their own advantage, and they do. And I'm wondering about, some of the studies that you did, like the Phoenician Biogon replication thing is not. It's not competition or cooperation, right? The person looking in the box, it's not clear what relationship you stand to them in the apple, but if you made it so that supposed to, if them and the monkey were competing for the apple or something, would you then?
See it, yeah. So a couple of things. One is, because the monkeys steal from us in these other contexts, and because anecdotally, one of the things that happens in those cases where the screen goes up is the monkey's like, oh, great, I could go take it. We have the sense that even though we haven't designed it as a competitive thing, that the monkeys think as soon as this person is not paying attention, I'm going to try to rip her off, right? But we haven't designed it that way. The second thing is that, like, in a lot of the primate stuff, I was like a real proponent of this like competitive thing. I thought, wow, this is like clear domain specificity, and there's all these reasons to think that. The data haven't borne that out exactly. They're definitely more into the task in these competitive cases, but so far what we've seen in all the mental representation stuff is that the stuff that they, if as long as you know they're doing the task, the stuff that they do in these competitive tasks, they kind of do in cooperative tasks too. The issue seems to not be about, we haven't done that many in capuchins, but definitely in the macaques and definitely in the chimps too, in the Tomasello and Brian Hare data. So I like really love this idea that it was like really domain specific and so on. It seems like the thing that's domain specific is their motivation to do the task, but as soon as like they're paying attention to the right components, the representations are available in all these contexts. But it's neither here nor there, because my guess is like our context is kind of, you know, the other thing is that they get those tasks in these other cases. So they are able to do the task when it's about predicting what the person's going to see, and even making correct predictions when the person's ignorant. The only thing they don't do is show these kind of contagious effects. So we can kind of stand on the fact that they're kind of doing it and processing it in these other contexts, it's just they don't kind of do it contagiously. It's an open question of whether they would do it contagiously with conspecifics. And we haven't done that because it's hard to do, but one could do something like that. The neat thing for humans is you don't need a conspecific, right? Like I show you a cartoon guy on the screen, and this is already, I mean, they might not be as broad as we are. One of the hypotheses we have so far that my student Lindsay, who you saw up there, is testing now, we don't have the answer yet, is that the way these processes work is that they're very flagrant at first. So any agent, you're like, oh yeah, I'm totally going to copy these things. But as soon as you give cues to outgroup hood, it shuts off. So that the process is ready to do Smurfs, but you tell me this Smurf has a different norm than you, or he's a different race than you, or whatever, then it shuts off. That's our hypothesis. We don't have evidence for that hypothesis, except that the over-imitation results don't happen as much in the context of outgroup members. But that's our prediction. So we're running all these little stupid object tests with different group members now. Yeah?
Do you think some of that can explain the in-group, out-group, the effects, the null results of the rhesus monkeys on Contagion, that they're watching a human with potential beliefs, as well as another macaque?
Yeah, and it would be fantastic. I mean, so the key is they think of us, and under that view, they sort of see us as sort of in-groupy when it's about the seeing and knowing part. It's really just for the contagiousness of it. And so it would be nice to really get the macaques to do it. The best we can come up with in Caio is pictures, and we don't, it's tricky. But yeah, but it is possible that we're just not doing the tests right. So, yeah. The hope is that, yeah, it sucks to not be macaque looking all the time. We need our like robotic, we need like these super suits where we're just a rhesus macaque. Very hard to do that, yeah.
With the macaques, you might be able to use rank food in the food preference test.
Yep.
If a high-ranking animal preferred a food item, to see if the social augmentation of that food item when the high-ranking animal wasn't there to prevent them.
Yeah, that would be, and the hope is that we may be able to get those effects better in the macaques and the capuchins. So Elsa and Jessie and her colleagues have some social learning and food preferences papers in brown capuchins, and at least in their captive capuchin hand, what they find is that you see social effects in that the capuchins will eat more in general, but they don't necessarily specifically eat more of the thing that the other individual is doing. And if I remember the paper correctly, they didn't look at rank in the capuchins, although I think there's a lot of reasons that you suspect to predict they might not show that in a way from the macaques would, for sure.
Even things like the ripeness of the fruit is a big issue for animals in the wild.
Yeah.
That we might get effects
of these things.
And,
yeah.
Or you might even be able to fake ripeness by color.
Yeah.
Pale out a person
Yeah, no, and we haven't tested, I mean, these guys have such painfully artificial stuff in the captive setting, but the rank issue is an interesting one. So to my knowledge, maybe somebody here knows and I don't, but to my knowledge, they haven't done the over-imitation kinds of studies with rank differences in the chimpanzees. They have done other social learning studies that aren't over-imitations, that are like correct imitation studies, where it's like the opaque box, you don't know how to do it. And what you find in chimpanzees is that they almost completely copy the strategies that the high-ranking female used versus the low-ranking female, but it's a case where both of those strategies are correct. Now, what I really want the White crew to do is like, it's really, I have this sensation all the time that I want other labs to run stuff that my lab can't run. I'm like, can you just run this research program for me that would help me answer my question? But I really want them to run an over-imitation case where the low-ranking guy does it efficiently and the high-ranking guy does it inefficiently to try to see. And the strong prediction is that humans would maybe be very susceptible to that, but the chimps wouldn't as much. But I don't think they've run that stuff just yet. But, yeah.
I was wondering about the case where you're, taking away 2 grapes versus 1 grape, or 2 versus 0, and then kind of gambling taxes. It seemed like, capuchins are very sensitive to the sort of quality of, you're getting 2 of the grapes. And so I was curious whether you've done the control where they drop them or they do something. And it just seemed from the images that you used, because you didn't show video and anything like that, but it just seemed like, I'm taking 2 for me and you get 1, and that seemed to introduce the whole sort of inequality aspect.
Yep. And so you only get the inequity effects when you're kind of taking them away, not when you're giving them, but I guess that's what you predict from the inequity effects. Really what happens is they take them away and they toss them in a cup. So the monkey doesn't think like this person like eating them or doing something like that with them. But in fact, one of my interpretations of some of the inequity aversion results that you get out of the Brosnan crew is that you could explain a lot of those via these economic biases in the absence of social information. And so the idea is that inequity aversion could just be a case of what we call reference dependence, which is like you don't care about the absolute number, you just care about yours relative to someone else. And if you add in loss aversion, you don't like getting less, then you in some sense get the Brosnan inequity aversion results for free, right? So the cucumber seems great when the cucumber is a reference point. The cucumber seems terrible when the grape is a reference point. The additional thing you have to explain is the social effects, but we know even in humans, in the behavioral economics literature, that social reference points are the most salient reference points. So your salary seems terrible if you find out that a colleague is making $1 more than you, even though it doesn't change your absolute purchasing power very much, right? And so if the conclusion also found social reference points is very salient, then you might not have to build in something richly inequity averse. You might just be able to kind of get it out of these behavioral economic biases. And I think the hint that that might be the right explanation is that my read is that so far there's really little evidence for advantageous inequity aversion, which depending on how you build the mechanism in, like you might want to see both sides, right? You kind of don't like it when you get more than other individuals too. But that, you wouldn't predict that on the grounds of this sort of loss aversion explanation, because you only kick in when you're like getting less is the idea. So I agree with you, and my hope is that it might be worth thinking about those other inequity aversion results in this context, or in some more domain general context than just the social domain.
This is kind of a conceptual question, but describing those things as irrational.
Yeah.
Is there, because you might imagine, especially it seems like this sort of deep homology of it lends further credence to the idea that it's not irrational.
Yeah.
And so, from a physics point of view, right, it's relative, it's absolute, and so the way economists set these things up is what the rational choice should be the wrong framing.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, the irrational framing is kind of a little leftover from how I usually give these talks to either economists or psychologists who, within the judgment decision-making framework, can come and introduce these things as deviations from normativity, right? I think the fact that capuchins show them raises really important questions about what these kinds of processes could be good for. There are some folks like Gary Becker, as economists, and others who are starting to use modeling to try to see under what context could it be good, and there's a couple different versions. One version is like, we're never perfectly rational because it makes heads too big to fit out of like reproductive tracts. It's hard to like do absolute choices. This is just a simple, it's like a Kuji mechanism that lets us get through life. The other version is these strategies are actually useful for something, and what could they be useful for? And this gets back to your question, which is, I think they could be particularly useful in the social domain, right? So I'm walking out in my group, and I'm going to groom you today. How much should I groom you? I don't know, there's no absolute amount of grooming, but socially it's relative. Like, you groomed me for an hour yesterday, I should probably groom you for an hour today, right? And so the idea is that these reference dependence and particularly loss aversion, to the extent that it's a domain general way to kind of achieve an equity aversion, they might be particularly useful biases in the social domain that get broadly applied. That's kind of our idea about how.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. But couldn't there even be a partially non-social? I mean, all of it has to be social in the sense of fitness differences or what's driving these things, right? And that's a social thing. But that it just could be actually true that that there's an asymmetry in fitness between gaining and losing something.
Oh, I
right?
see what you're saying.
The grape, losing the grape versus gaining the grape, that's the same number of calories, but the fitness consequences could be asymmetric.
That's right.
And in that sense, not irrational at all.
That's right. And probably these are in the so I guess you can distinguish between real gains and real losses versus these kind of framed gains and framed losses. And for real gains and real losses, there are huge fitness consequences. You need mechanisms to kind of freak out if there's losing involved, either because somebody didn't groom you enough, or there's less food in some area that you thought there was going to be, whatever. So you set up some reference point, you evaluate everything relative to it. You don't need mechanisms to be like, hey, this was more awesome than I expected. But you definitely need mechanisms to be like, wow.
Right, I was counting on this, but now it's...
Exactly. The key is that you wouldn't expect that. So the reason that these things are kind of thought of as irrational is that they're not real gains and losses. They just kind of seem like gains and losses. But you can imagine if, to the extent that you need mechanisms to do real gains and losses, then a lot of these kinds of things make sense, even in a more domain general way. The salient one, the fact that the social ones are more salient though in humans, and maybe if you can buy this inequity aversion account, might mean that it's especially good in that domain. But I think even in the foraging context, it kind of makes sense. You need things that when things violate your expectations in a way that's worse for you in terms of your reward, you need mechanisms to like learn that fast, figure things out.
So while I agree entirely with Clark's perspective in terms of the kind of the potential asocial adaptive value, I think given your intellectual agenda here, one inherently social feature, which I suppose people like Kahneman might see this as just another version of loss aversion. I don't think it is. I think it's a much more specific thing, is that humans show marked asymmetry in their credulity regarding information about hazards and information about benefits. And they're much more credulous of information about hazards, which is consistent with the asymmetry in the two errors, looking at it from an error management perspective, that one might commit, right? So if you're erroneously credulous of information about hazards, you acquire a bunch of erroneous beliefs, and you're unnecessarily cautious, and if you're erroneously incredulous, you may be dead, right? So this is really pronounced in people, and it seems to me that this is a feature of the social transmission that perhaps because the imitation over-imitation literature has been so focused on artifacts, those artifacts are always framed in terms of benefits, right? So a nice experiment, and I'd be happy if you did it or Andy Whiten did it, I don't care, is, if, gosh, there's a loud buzzer or a nasty shock inside the artificial fruit, right? Sometimes that gets triggered, and my expectation would be that not only would you see an exaggeration of the pattern that's already there in humans, even when the box is transparent and so on, but that you might start to see it in animals. Now, I mean, that said, that's a kind of a Panglossian hyperadaptationist prediction. When you look empirically at the literature, it's striking how little animals seem to attend to conspecifics for information about hazards, right? So if you look at the rodent literature and you look at, diet and learning, from conspecifics, they seem to be ignoring a whole bunch of information that they could be using in a pretty costly way. So there may be constraints on how well the system could evolve in other species, but it seems like if you're going to find it anywhere, you're going to find it in regard to that.
That's a really good idea. And particularly with things that are hazard in a fearful hazard way. We were talking earlier about the Meineke stuff, right? Those are examples in which animals are fast socially learning about things. The critical thing for the over-imitation is that it has to be they have to kind of, I would have otherwise thought it was inaccurate, right? Or and that's That I think we don't know yet in animals, but it would be really cool to test.
Right, but people have talked about, superstitions in animals, right? How they seem to rapidly acquire precautionary behaviors that aren't necessarily efficacious, right? Which is consistent with an error management approach to, the environment. Where, I better be really concerned about this.
And in some ways, it would be even more striking if we didn't get it in the social domain, right? If we didn't get over-imitation in non-human animals in that sense. And it's just they have this whole system for kind of error management. It just still
right. So if you have a species that shows that kind of superstitious behavior, the ready learning of precautionary behavior, but doesn't show the over-imitation in the presence of hazards, then they're just missing a whole bunch of mechanisms for social information transmission. There's no other explanation.
No, that's a really good idea. They get past their eye cock of showing coyote monkey is really terrifying. Yeah, that's good.
One of your graphs showed the individual capuchins and their performance and showed some individual differences. Do you ever think about actually focusing on individual differences or looking at age, sex differences, adolescent effects?
Yeah, it's such an important and good question. It's so hard to do if you have 8 capuchin monkeys who do it, right? What we're trying to do now with some of these social contagion effects and some of these sort of theory-mindy kinds of studies on seeing and knowledge is that at Cayo Santiago we have a big enough population that we can look at that stuff. And so we're now, typically in our studies, because in my psychologist hat we just want our sample size of 30 individuals and that's it. Now what we're doing is we're trying to run as many individuals in the whole population as we can on the same studies, and that will give us the kind of variance that you want to see in age, in sex, in particularly things like dominance or social network position. We're doing this in collaboration with Michael Platt's group, who has information on all these individual. I mean, we can do age and gender, right? But we can't do all the other cool stuff. And so they have those data. And we can start potentially looking at that stuff. And so historically, we haven't with the captive guys because we always put that up, and it's like, look, it would be so cool if we could really test if it was because he was high ranking or whatever.
Especially loss aversion, that was an interesting thing to see if that changed with adolescents, for example.
Exactly, and potentially we're running it now such that we can retest individuals over time to look at that. I was talking earlier this morning about the time of male dispersal, right? Maybe that's a time where these social preferences about decisions just change. We have mechanisms to change them completely. Otherwise, you would never leave, right?
You can't set some risk, you're stuck.
Yeah. So I think this stuff is really important. The other thing Michael's group is doing is that they're working with the Cayo stock to kind of genotype all the individuals because in the psychological literature, particularly some of these economic preferences are strongly, to extend to anything, strongly linked with different alleles, linked with things like different dopamine receptor alleles and stuff like that, particularly for risk and stuff like that. And so we're hoping that we can look at that potential variation as well. It's a bit of a founder effect population in Cayo because they were brought there, but so far it looks like for certain of the different candidate genes they're looking at, there is some variation. And so, although I was talking to Joe about this earlier, we did a first pass at some of our tests, our little cognitive tests to see what it looked like for the different alleles. And for some of them, it looked like what we're predicting from the different alleles isn't their performance in the cognitive test. We're just predicting whether or not we tested them at all. So folks know this way better than me, but this serotonin transporter, there's the short, long, and I forget which direction, but there's one that's they're kind of a little socially anxious. We didn't have any of the ones that had alleles of social anxious in our study because we just never saw them to test them. Or if we approached them, they would run away before we got them. So it seems like we're predicting individual differences, but we might not have the cognitive data on some of the guys to really test it out. It's cool.
Any more questions?
All right, thanks so much.